Great. I think we're going to get started. It's wonderful to see so many people here. Happy Mid-Autumn Festival, welcome to the first Long Institute event of the 2025-2026 academic year. I'm Emily Baum. I'm the faculty director of the Long Institute, and on behalf of myself and my executive director, Anne Tong, who is somewhere over there, we are very happy to kick things off with our first speaker of the year, my good friend, Maggie Greene, who is an associate professor of modern Chinese history and East Asian cultural history at Montana State University. Maggie and I go way back to when we were both a pair of very stressed out graduate students at UC San Diego. And I've always been a big admirer of hers. We were writing our first books together and we did a sort of chapter exchange. And I remember she sent me the conclusion to her book and I read it just riveted by the writing. And I wrote back to her and said, I didn't want the book to end. And I really think that that is the first and presumably the last time I will ever make such a comment about an academic monograph. But that just goes to show what a fantastic writer she is. The book that resulted from that chapter exchange was her first book, Resisting Spirits, Drama Reform and Cultural Transformation in the People's Republic of China, which was published in 2019 with University of Michigan Press. And if you're interested in theater, if you're interested in the cultural history of modern China, or if you're just interested in very depressing stories about intellectuals who have their lives ruined by the Chinese Communist Party, I highly suggest that you read this book. It is fabulous. Maggie has also written on a variety of other topics, ranging from mahjong to video games, and she's currently at work on her latest project, A History of Mountaineering in the PRC, and that will be the subject of her talk today. So please join me in welcoming Maggie Greene.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Long Institute for inviting me, and thank you to Emily for getting this all set up. I apologize for looking a little slubby. The Southwest was nice enough to lose my baggage. So it was a toasty 38 degrees Fahrenheit yesterday in Bozeman. We had our first snow of the season. So I'm kind of in full winter gear. So I'm never going to forgive Southwest for this. As Emily mentioned, I've done work on a lot of different things, but this is what is leading towards my second book project. But I will note, it's not a book yet, so this is going to be a little different, I think, than most book talks. I'm going to talk you through how I got into this subject, and then we'll talk about the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s primarily, and then some sort of more contemporary issues. I've done the most work on the 1950s and the 1960s, and we've got lots and lots and lots of images. So I'm at Montana State University, and I have to say, if you're into mountains or mountaineering, it's actually a pretty good university to be at. Our tagline is literally, come on, there we go, mountains and vines, which is, again, sort of a driving force. We have a lot of people across the university who do actually a lot of work on different aspects of mountains, on snow science, et cetera, which again makes a lot of sense because we are in Bozeman, Montana, and we are surrounded by mountains. These are the Bridgers, this is actually a photograph taken from our airport. It's like a 20-minute drive from town. It's easier to find places that you can't see mountains, or it's harder to find places you can't see mountains than it is. So it is really actually a kind of cool place. And I have to say, I don't know if I would be this into this project had I not wound up in a place like Bozeman. But in particular, I'm pretty lucky because of my department, which historically has been pretty strong in environmental humanities. We also have people working on history of science, and I'm very lucky to have a colleague, Dr. Michael Reedy, who is a historian of science, but himself a mountaineer. And so over the past couple of years, we've started developing a group of the two of us and grad students where we have a reading group, but we have also presented a couple of conferences that we hope to keep going. Here is Michael climbing the Weisshorn in the Alps back in 2011 and collecting rocks, because as we will see, mountaineering and science are very tightly interrelated. And our last mountain event was actually in 2024. A lot of fun, but we've really tried to start building a community around mountains and mountain studies at MSU, but also to get connections to other people working on mountains in a whole range of different ways. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got into mountaineering, because one thing I found, and I was talking to Jeff today at lunch, and I said, China scholars never seem to have any problem with the fact that I study games, and I study mountains, and I study theater. They're like, well, Maggie's a cultural historian of 20th century China. This looks like 20th century Chinese cultural history to me. It turns out a lot of people are much more flummoxed by this. And Emily mentioned that we were a pair of very stressed out grad students. And one of the things that I did to relax when I was in coursework was I actually read a lot of adventuring literature, because I couldn't imagine anything more different than being a grad student in modern Chinese history on the shores of La Jolla, California, than climbing Annapurna or being in the Karakoram somewhere. So I would lay in the bath after very long days of seminar and being a TA and feast on the wide variety of literature that is out there, particularly on mountains. Mountaineering is often called the most literary of sports. That's not sort of much of a joke. One of the things that I really noticed, particularly in the narratives that are centered in the Himalaya and in the Karakoram, right, obviously in Asia, they're overwhelmingly white, they're overwhelmingly male. Asian people don't show up very often, or if they do, they show up as the happy, friendly, helpful Sherpa, usually, or the happy, friendly, helpful Sherpa who's happy to die for you. And I was thinking, gosh, this is a little weird. And then when I started getting into more contemporary stuff, like Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, which is about the 1996 Everest disaster, I started noting that when Asian teams showed up, they were harbingers of death and destruction. And I've mentioned this to other people who study mountaineering, and at first they go, oh, that's not true. And I said, no, really, like, think about it. And then they were like, oh, you're actually kind of right. And I found this just really odd in some respects. And I knew that there must have been a history of Asian mountaineering, and obviously there absolutely is, but it was not represented in the literature. The literature, again, is overwhelmingly white and Anglo-European and male. But I was a grad student, and I knew my advisors would kill me if I went off on yet another tangent onto something else. So I just kind of filed all this away and said, I'll come back to this later, or someone else will pick it up. Strangely, actually, it was ghost opera that brought me back to mountaineering. And this is one thing I say when people say, oh, surely there's no connection between theater and, ghost opera and mountaineering. I said, actually, there's more than you might expect. So in 2011, 2012, I was living in Shanghai, researching my dissertation. And one thing that I was doing, I was buying a lot of sources on kongfuzi.com, which is the world's best secondhand book website. I miss it so much. And one of the things that I purchased was actually just one sheet of newspaper from a Shanghai newspaper from 1967 during the Cultural Revolution, and it was on the ghost play problem in Shanghai, 1949 to 1963. And it came with an essay that was a pretty bog standard. Here's why ghost plays are bad, and here's why we should make the intellectuals that wrote them incredibly miserable. And then it went on to have a list of all the plays that had been performed in Shanghai, ghost plays that had been performed in Shanghai, at least by Cultural Revolution era definitions between 1949 and 1963. I'm not going to go into a big whole history on ghost opera, obviously that's not our point here, but I will say, generally speaking, the sort of general understanding of what a ghost opera is it's traditional Chinese qi, right? Traditional Chinese drama, and it's always in the historical past. It's not huaju, it's not spoken language drama, and it's not on contemporary themes. So imagine my shock when the very first play that shows up is here boxed in red, and it's a play called Chumalongma, which is the Mandarin transliteration of the Tibetan Chomolungma, what we call Mount Everest. And I was like, that's bizarre. And then I saw it was performed by Reni, and I just knew from my archival documents that was a Huaju troupe. Even weirder, it gives a brief description of what the play is, and it says, okay, this is a play about climbing Mount Everest. Again, my mind was sort of blown. And then it was the next sentence, and it said that this is a bad play because there is a ghost of a dead foreign imperialist and 5 Buddhist mountain spirits. Now, the 5 Buddhist mountain spirits, I wasn't particularly surprised by, but the dead foreign imperialist, I said, oh my God, it's George Mallory. George Mallory is showing up in a 1962 Shanghainese Huaju. This is wild. We'll come back to Mallory, but if you're not familiar with him, he's a really iconic figure in early 20th century mountaineering. He died on Everest, actually, in 1924. So at this point, I'm starting to get kind of interested. Well, what's going on with this mountaineering stuff? And then I got back to California. I was cruising around looking up databases that we have access to, stuff like Busho. And I was just looking to see if there had been things that have been updated since I had been in China. And I was in particular looking for one of the guys that I write about a lot in my book, a man by the name of Meng Chao. And I saw that he appeared in an issue in 1960 of Xinqiyu, New Sport and Physical Culture. For a variety of reasons, you're usually not expecting radical leftist authors to show up in Xinqiyu, especially not ones that go on to write a really celebrated ghost opera. But indeed, there he was, writing a poem about Mount Everest. And this is at the point where I just said, okay, there really is something here about mountaineering. I will say it's kind of a fun poem. I'll come back and show you another part of the stanza. This also strained me, having spent a long time thinking about ghost opera, having to look up all these characters, what the hell is that? Oh, it's a crampon. Okay, I know what those are. I think for a variety of reasons, this is what pushed me sort of over the edge. And then I really started looking at the academic scholarship on mountaineering. And again, with sort of very few exceptions, most scholarship has been written from a European history perspective, an American history perspective. There tend not to be too much representation from people working in area studies, right, broadly defined. And I started thinking, okay, well, there's a place for me here, even though I'm not a climber, right? I do know a lot about mountain climbing at this point, and I do bring skills to the table that maybe a lot of other people don't have. So you do see some descriptions of Chinese history and the history of Chinese mountaineering in some of these books. But the book that I really think of as being sort of most rooted in what we might think of as area studies perspective is Sherry Ortner's Life and Death on Mount Everest. A lot of the other books are just really quite general. They're people that don't have Chinese language skills or Japanese language skills or anything other than European languages and English. And so you wind up with statements like this, which is from Unsworth's very classic work on Everest. From time to time, word is sent out from Peking telling of the ascent of some mighty peak deep in China or Tibet, usually accompanied by photographs and vague details which give nothing away and are sometimes so riddled with inconsistencies as to be totally baffling. So there's, I think, a lot of room, actually, not just for China scholars, but scholars working in a lot of different areas to sort of enter the conversation. So that's where I am coming from. And we'll come back to some of the issues that I raise in this. I just want to talk really briefly about mountaineering. I will say I'm used to giving this presentation in mountain studies or mountaineering history environments where I have to spend a lot of time explaining, and this is what the Great Leap Forward was, and this is what the Cultural Revolution was. And I figured in this case, maybe I should spend a little more time talking about what is mountaineering. It's a sport, obviously. It develops really in the 19th century. It's growing out of the Enlightenment, and it's going to go on to play a really important role in politics, in science, in a lot of areas of life. And it's really going to start developing in Europe, in the Alps. So by the latter half of the 19th century, you see a lot of examples of people going out and doing quite a lot of climbing in the Alps. And by the time you start having people sort of show up in the Himalaya, you already have this sort of identifiable sport. And then you have got these really big mountains in Asia that look pretty exciting. Over here on the left are actually two Swiss mountain guides. So lest you think that guided climbing started with the Sherpas, it didn't. It has a very long history. Over here we've got a representation of a lady climbing in the Alps. Yes, women climb mountains too, and they have since the 19th century. But what is mountaineering? Because there's a lot of different kinds of mountain sports, right? And you've got skiing, and you have hiking, and you have climbing, and mountaineering involves climbing, but not all climbing is mountaineering. And so I asked my colleague, Dr. Reedy, Michael, how would you define mountaineering, right? What makes it mountaineering? And the first thing he said gear. And even dating back to the 19th century, and we'll see some photographs from the early 20th century, you see a lot of very specialized gear. You don't just decide to go climb Mont Blanc in your tennis shoes or trail runners, okay? We're talking everything from ropes, you see there's a lot of ropes in this picture, to specialized boots, to crampons, which are down here, to all sorts of other equipment that you use when you're on the rope. The second thing that he said is time and distance in many cases. For instance, you can go on a hike and you can go for a climb maybe in a day and not have to think too hard about, well, where are we going to start from? And then what does this look like, right? How are we going to proceed from here? But in many cases, you're dealing with very long days. And so unless you're an exceptional individual, you're often not going to be doing sort of car-to-car climbing. For instance, this is why in the Alps, if you go to the European Alps and other ranges in Europe, there's a hut system. The idea is people who are going to be climbing these mountains are in fact going to need a place to stay for the night, so they can set out at sort of predetermined times to figure out how they're going to get to the top of this mountain, hopefully, in the time available to him. This is actually Michael's climbing partner, also on the Weisshorn. It's a little hard to see, but you can see he's got his gear, and he's also roped up. He's actually roped to Michael in this photograph. The other thing that I'm actually really interested in particular is actually a specialized form of mountaineering, and that's high altitude mountaineering. Generally speaking, I'm interested in the biggest mountains in the world, and some that are not quite as big, but still pretty large. And the biggest mountains in the world are 8,000 meter peaks. There's 14 of them. All of them are in the Himalaya or the Karakoram. These are some of the most iconic mountains in mountaineering history. And altitude itself is actually going to be a really complicating factor when it comes to climbing. Humans are just really not particularly well designed to live at extreme altitudes. It's very hard for your blood to get as much oxygen as it needs. So this is one reason that when you're talking about climbing the big peaks, and not only are you're talking about expeditions that are going to be far longer than a day. To climb Mount Everest, you're probably looking at 50 or 60 days for both the trek in and then acclimatizing, right, on the mountain. It's not that there aren't difficult mountains to climb that are smaller. There absolutely are, and there's certainly some of these high altitude mountains that are not quite as complicated, or wouldn't be technically complicated, but because of the difficulties of altitude, this is really going to be something that makes high altitude mountaineering can be pretty exciting, especially when horrible things are happening and people are dying. But just to give you an example, this is actually the north side of Mount Everest, and I just wanted to show what this sort of looks like, because what you do when you're climbing high mountains is you climb up, and then you climb back down, and then you climb back up a little higher, and you climb back down. So this is why you have camps, right, set up. But by the time you hit Camp 3, that's a point where human life cannot be sustained, even if you are taking oxygen. You're basically dying. Your body is dying. every night you're spending above 8,000 meters. So you spend all this time going up and down and up and down and up and down so that you can finally, hopefully, do a summit push and then get all the way back down the mountain in what are frequently 18 or 20-hour days. I'm going to be talking about Everest a lot here, partially because it's one of the most well-documented mountains, also because that's what a lot of my work has been on so far. So when I finally started buying sources and digging up sources on mountaineering, I found out there was a lot of stuff being published in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s in all sorts of venues. You have book publications, you have stuff appearing in a variety of different kinds of magazines, you have stuff that's showing up in, perhaps not surprisingly, sports magazines, but also, as you can see here, science magazines. There's actually quite, we'll come back and talk more in detail about this one up in the top left corner, quite actually lavish photo books that are being published. So there's a lot of writing out there. And there's a lot of not good writing. And we will come back and talk about this poem, which is a very not good poem. And it's very long. But there's a lot out there, right, in terms of source material. And this is something that I'm still collecting. But one of the things I was really interested in when looking at the 1950s was actually sort of the use of mountaineering in international relations. And perhaps not surprisingly, mountaineering was really important in the Soviet Union. So one thing that you see actually in a lot of the 1950s publications up until about 1957 is a ton of joint Sino-Soviet expeditions. Some of these are taking place in China. Some of them are taking place in the Soviet Union. It's very clear that climbers are going and getting training. The Soviet Union didn't have any 8,000 meter peaks, but it has some quite vicious 7,000 meter peaks that are quite famous. And so I was like, okay, well, this is a sort of interesting angle to get at, right? The relationship between the Soviet Union and China. And you can sort of see why mountaineering would be really appealing. It's a very modern sport. This is also the period in the 1950s and the 1960s where all of the 14 8,000 meter peaks are going to be successfully summited, as far as we know, for the first time. And that's going to take place between 1953 and 1964. So globally, this is actually a sport that has a lot of visibility. And it makes, again, perfect sense why there would be support thrown behind this for the government. Also, the way mountaineering tends to be conducted in this period is sort of siege style tactics. It's not individuals off climbing a mountain, it's a whole bunch of people collectively working together to get up the mountain. And again, you can sort of see why this would be appealing, right, in the high socialist period. You can see examples. These are some of my favorite drawings from a 1950 publication. You know, we've got the obviously the flag lashed to our ice axe, of course, not just a useful tool for getting up a mountain, useful for other things. I always thought the image on the right was actually going to be my book cover, and then Emily made a fantastic poster, and I was like, maybe I like this one better. But, you know, again, this idea of we are summiting, we are making these achievements, we are spreading Chinese socialism is going to be a huge one. It's also, as I mentioned, actually really bound up in science. And this is, again, totally true, actually also for Western mountaineering. Even though a lot of people who climb mountains just really want to climb mountains, they don't necessarily want to be picking up rocks, but we're going to use science to justify why we need to go off on these expeditions. So in many cases, you're actually going to see Chinese teams that are coming from various universities and other sort of academic units, ostensibly to climb and summit mountains, but also to do science. So this is the Beijing Institute of Geology, and this is the first summit of a mountain in Qinghai in 1960. So again, you see tons of these kinds of images throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, by the end of the 1950s, we have the sort of Sino-Soviet split happening. We also have the Great Leap Forward, and that is actually going to overlap which makes perfect sense, with the first big Chinese expedition to Mount Everest, which is going to be the first successful summit of Mount Everest from the north side. It had already successfully been summited from the south side in 1953 by a British team. This is going to be a very important expedition for a number of reasons, but again, and actually in the political context of the Great Leap Forward, right, we're going to leap forward in all areas of life. Well, what could be a bigger leap than actually getting to the top of the world's tallest mountain? And indeed, my dude Meng Chao, who I already mentioned briefly, is going to write a poem, and it appears in People's Daily in 1958, and it ends with, "This era is already different than those before. It seems like riding an elevator up a mountain. You who always have many kinds of misgivings, watch us fly to the summits of the Himalayas," right? And then he's going to come back and write another poem in 1960. But of course, this is also a really complicated time politically, right? By the time that the expedition is sort of drawing to a close in 1960, the Great Famine is in full swing. You have the Sino-Soviet split, which has, completely happened. I don't have proof yet, but I'm pretty sure this expedition was originally intended to be a joint Sino-Soviet expedition, and then just became a Chinese expedition for, again, international political reasons. But it's also going to be really important because this is going to be the first really big Chinese mountaineering achievement. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories related to it. We're still talking about exactly what happened on the 1960 expedition. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The first is that the story told about the summit is a little crazy, and I will explain why. It's also that there is no photographic evidence and there's no photographic proof, which, really in these days, people want to see GPS proof that you actually managed to the top of the mountain. But in 1960, you want a photograph at the very least. That doesn't happen. We do have photographs of the team on the mountain, but the report of this is met with a lot of skepticism in the West, at least initially in 1960, because again, the story is quite crazy. And some of this has to do actually with Everest and how Everest is in the top of the mountain. And the point that is going to be the sort of serious point is the so-called second step, which you can see up here, right below the summit. The reason the second step is special is because it's actually a very tricky bit of climbing. Again, it wouldn't be difficult if you were at sea level, but when you're above 8,000 meters, right, you're very, very high up. You're probably exhausted. You can't really breathe. How are we going to get up this thing? And actually, the 1975 Chinese expedition is, I know this is, again, a little hard to see, lashed a ladder to it. But that didn't exist in 1960. So the story that came out was that the guys on this expedition, the three that are on the final summit push, it got dark. They ran out of oxygen. And then they got to the second step and they were sort of like, how the hell are we going to get up that big? So they apparently took their boots off and made a human ladder. Now you can kind of see why a lot of people would meet this with like, you did what? Because it does absolutely sound totally bonkers. But it sort of came out later after people were able to actually talk to some of these mountaineers. They knew stuff about what was above the second step that nobody had ever seen before, or nobody had ever reported on. So I think these days it is generally credited that this ascent did in fact happen. However, we'll come back to this because again, there's still conspiracy theories related to it. It's also, again, something that we're going to see over and over and over again. Certain representations are going to come out in these expeditions, particularly related to Tibet. And of course, in 1959, you have the Lhasa uprising. So this is going to be a very different picture of the relationship of Tibet to Han Chinese in the PRC. As we can see, the PLA's Tibet Region Cultural Troupe is bringing the generous friendship of the Tibetan people to the highest stage in the world. So mountaineering is actually going to be functioning in a lot of different ways throughout the course of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. I mentioned that in 1960, Meng Chao is going to write this poem that appears in Xin Qi. That issue of Xin Qi actually had a number of other very famous writers who are going to be talking about the Everest expedition. And my favorite part of Meng Chao's poem is actually in the second stanza. I love this, and I wish it weren't quite so long because I think 600 million, a mountaineering party of 600 million would be a great book title, but it's just slightly too long. So he moves from the first stanza where he's going to be talking about this actual expedition and what it looks like to then imagining the relationship of mountaineering to the nation. 600 million heroes are just one mountaineering party, climbing mountain after mountain, climbing range after range, 600 million heroes gathered atop a high summit. So again, mountaineering is playing a really important role in sort of constructing ideas about the nation and nationalism. It is doing the same thing in the West as well. Okay, this is not weird or strange at all. And again, this expedition is going to produce a lot of cultural production. Decent poems like this one, horrible poems like this one. It is really, it's so bad. It is really, the first time I read this, when I got to Tashishe, I was like, this is not happening. He's the party secretary of our mountaineering party. Like, if you have to write that in a poem, just write an essay instead, okay? That's my sort of suggestion. But one of the other things that this is gonna be doing is setting up China versus Europe in particular, in the West, sort of in general, right? This sort of way he's talking to this is just, I don't even know. I could go on at length about this poem. But you can see, you know, foreign explorers couldn't get up you, but our people, right, managed to. I also mentioned the play that comes out in 1962, Jumalongma. I do actually, I don't have the script, and I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to find the script, but I do have the playbill from 1962, which is actually a pretty interesting document. It's got a lot of other information on the other side. Obviously, this is not like a faithful representation of what Everest looks like from a verticality perspective. But it is trying to give a lot of information, right, about the mountain, about mountaineering, and why this is important. I do remember, it was sort of funny, I had to have a friend of mine help me purchase this, and I was buying a bunch of other stuff off Kongfuza as well, and he got all of those, and then he kept leaving this one off, and I finally had to be like, I want that, like, do not let that get out of your hands. You know, this is a rare item. It's actually, the play itself though, you know, was reviewed in a couple of places, and we do have some still images, and in my first article on mountaineering, which is entitled Performing Socialism at Altitude, I talk about how these people are literally, right, performing in a theatrical sense, altitude. And here this is an image from Shanghai Theater. This is the dead foreign imperialist. I mean, I think George Mallory is actually much better looking than this guy, but you know, it's okay. But again, this is, I think, a sort of interesting way of trying to render mountaineering legible and understandable to people who live in Shanghai and have probably never climbed a mountain in their life. They certainly are not using oxygen apparatus and you know, ice axes. So one thing that I think is really important about mountaineering in this period is this performance of socialism, both literal performance like this, but then also the ways in which we see people performing when they're actually out mountaineering. There's also, you know, once we start moving actually through the 1960s, 1964, there's another big achievement, and that's actually the first successful summit of Shishapangma, which is another 8,000 meter peak. That was actually the last 8,000 meter peak to be conquered, as it were. And you can see in some propaganda images related to it, and this is actually a set of 4, how mountaineering is being presented again is this very collective activity, but one that is, of course, going to be very important for the nation. And we've got people down here doing calisthenics, right? And there's Shoshapangma in the back. You can see this very long line of people who are trying to make their way up the mountain, overcoming great obstacles, right? Great difficulties, in helping each other. And then I love the image on the right. I need a copy of this for my office. The person just very, like, just now is like, okay. And the little red book is over there too. This is why I almost sent this one to Emily for the poster, but I was like, no, the other one's better. But this one is just sort of kitsch overload. I love it. Throughout the 60s, though, we're going to have representations of these really serious climbs, right? Things that amateurs are not going to undertake or are not going to sort of undertake willingly. But you also see other depictions of climbing in particular, but also mountaineering in publications that are sort of aimed at the masses in terms of how can we get people right into this sport? How can we get them climbing mountains for the nation? And this is actually an image that appears at the very beginning of the Cultural Revolution. I don't necessarily recommend learning how to climb from mass science, but it is actually pretty interesting, right? I mean, this is showing up in a science magazine, but it's teaching you, okay, here's how you downstep, right, safely on a mountain. The guy also doesn't have crampons on, which is maybe a slight problem. Here's how you tie, right, a harness to help keep yourself safe while you're climbing. So I'm very much focused on the sort of elite aspects of mountaineering, particularly high altitude mountaineering, but I also recognize that there's a much more sort of popular aspect to this. Now we're getting to my favorite part, which is actually the 1966 to 68 Chinese Academy of Sciences Tibetan Scientific Expedition. And as Emily said, my book is, well, it's not all depressing, but it's pretty depressing, right? And part of it is because of the Cultural Revolution. My view of the Cultural Revolution before I came into this project was death and destruction, people getting beaten to death by Red Guards, people committing suicide because they were worried about what was going to come next, people getting, struggled against and criticized, people getting thrown in prison. I certainly was not associating the Cultural Revolution with any sort of Academy of Sciences expedition, right? Universities are being shut down and intellectuals are being criticized. So I was actually amazed when I got a copy of a book that was published in 1974 about this expedition. It really sort of changed my perception of what the Cultural Revolution could mean, right? In different spaces. It also gave me sort of insight into some of the unintended sort of gazes that you see coming out of the Cultural Revolution, and actually even earlier. So the book in question is this one in the front, and it's actually quite a lavish book. For instance, it cost about 25 yuan, and this book that's behind it was about 2 yuan. So I mean, it's a very expensive book, relatively speaking. It's very, very, it's actually really cool. The paper quality is fantastic. There's a lot of like pull-out images, and there's, like panorama shots. There's a lot going on. And there's a lot of really, really, really cool images, and it's actually the images that made me sort of rethink what the Cultural Revolution could have meant. Because I can assure you, whatever else was happening to Meng Chao in 1966, he did not look like he was on a Boy Scout camp out, right? And here we've got people singing to their heart's content. And I saw this, I was like, do they have s'mores? Like, this is kind of amazing. There are other images that are, I think, what we would sort of think of more typically, right, associated with the Cultural Revolution. But yeah, fun was never a word that I was like, Cultural Revolution fun, no. But, they actually seem to be having a pretty good time. This is a very different depiction of socialism than, Red Guards terrorizing intellectuals. This is one of my very favorite images for a variety of reasons. They're very actually clear in a lot of the captions. They're very clear about it's Han and Tibetan expedition members. My favorite is the dude over here, because he just looks so over it. He's like, guys, we're at 6,200 meters. It's cold. The air is thin. Do we really have to have a study session here right now? But again, this is a certain performance, right, of socialism. The photographs are also really interesting because one thing that you occasionally read from Western sources is people sort of assuming that, Chinese equipment, et cetera, must have been really far behind what you see in the West. And that actually isn't really the case. Here we have, again, everybody's having a really good time. This is not just not what I think of when I think the Cultural Revolution. There's also, though, I think a lot of unintended sort of depictions or things that the people putting the book together probably didn't want to say. And one thing I argue in the article is that actually what we really see in a lot of these photographs is very much an imperial gaze on Tibet from the point of view of the center. You see a lot of images that look strikingly like images that foreigners were taking in places like Tibet and Nepal in the 20s and 30s, right? We have the nice, helpful locals who are showing us all sorts of things related to geology and features. Of course, everybody is very happy to be showing off the abundance of produce and very happy to be receiving propaganda posters now. Interestingly, too, women are basically not seen in these images, certainly not of the mountaineers. And basically, the only time you see them is usually local Tibetan women who are often dressed in, interesting, traditional, colorful clothing, which we're sort of seeing a lot of similarities between what gets produced in the West as well. The landscape is also going to be presented as being mysterious, beautiful. This is actually one of my favorite shots in the book, which is, of course, of a pine forest. But there's also going to be an emphasis on what can Tibet do for the nation in a productive capacity, right? So you see stuff like this. This is what the book ends with. It's kind of unfortunate because the rest of it, you're like, oh, cool, we're like beautiful forests and Mount Everest, and then we're like a lumber yard. But this is, again, sending a sort of very particular message. And I remember many years ago, Michael asked me, well, do you think there's a difference between socialist mountaineering and like what we see in, Europe or the United States? I said, oh, there must be some difference, besides the fact that it's socialist. And then I found out, like, no, actually, very much the same things are going on. But I really want to think about this, right, in the Chinese context. Finally, I just want to end by talking a little bit about some sort of contemporary issues that I want to draw out in my work. And some of these do far predate the sort of past 20 years or so, but have been sort of thrown into high relief. And one of the big ones is actually access, and who has access, who can get access to these mountains. What does that look like? This isn't just an issue in the Chinese context. It's an issue in Nepal. It's an issue in Pakistan. It's something that has been going on for a long time, right? For instance, in the 1960s, in a foreign ministry document, they're actually discussing whether or not to allow a French team to come and climb Everest. And what actually gets mentioned is we kind of don't think the French have been nice to us in a geopolitical context, so we're not going to let them come, right? There is a recognition that access to these mountains is actually can be used in really important political ways. And this has actually just, I think, gotten more intense over the years. But of course, mountaineering and sort of what it looks like has changed. Now, what you're really thinking of are a lot of private climbers and people who are trying to get visas. What does that look like? What do the permits look like? How expensive are they? And this is an issue that gets a lot of critique, actually, from, if you go hang out on our mountaineering on Reddit, you'll see a lot of complaints about not just China, but other places as well. Like, why are the permits so expensive? And why do we need visas to go visit it anyway? Like, it's this sort of idea that Mount Everest is, this such an iconic place that it belongs to everyone. And I'm kind of like, that's not really how modern nation states operate, but okay. But this is, again, something that is going to continues to come up. And one of the things that happened last year, actually, is that the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association, which is in charge of exactly what it sounds like, and is the big power, came out with a lot of new regulations related to the climbing, particularly of the really big mountains, the 7,000 and 8,000 meter peaks. And they are actually sort of saying, and this is how you can climb the mountain, which has, of course, raised umbrage among a lot of people. So, for instance, they say you're going to climb the traditional route and don't change it unless you've, cleared it with us. If you're going to choose something else, you have to tell us. Foreigners have to be accompanied by a professional mountain guide. Altitude oxygen, right? So oxygen apparatus have to be used above 7,000 meters. This is a big one. Most people who climb very big mountains climb mountains with oxygen, but there are very, very skilled people and people who are physiologically suited to it who don't actually have to. And so they climb oxygenless. The Tibet Mountaineering Association is saying, no, you're not going to do that anymore. You have to have a Chinese liaison officer. This isn't new. And then finally, they have the ability to do everything up to and including closing routes, right? And closing mountains. And they have actually done that, right, in the past. So this access issue is one that I'm really interested in. But the last thing, and I think in some respects sort of the most fun, is conspiracy theories, because there are a lot of them. There was a movie that came out in 2019 called Pantongzhe, and a friend of mine, actually, and Emily's, was in Beijing and sent me a photograph from the Beijing subway and said, have you heard about this movie that's coming out? And I said, no, I haven't, but I'll look it up. And it actually turned up on Amazon. It's a movie that's so bad, it's good. I highly recommend getting a six-pack and just like chilling with it, because there's a lot to unpack. The movie is putatively about the 1960 and 1975 actually expeditions, and it's the 1975 expedition that lashes the ladder to the second step. Anyway, it's a fantastically bad movie. But one of the things that really interested me is the movie actually starts off by sort of showing the 1960 ascent, and then the climbers get back and they're getting criticized for not taking photographs, right? And everybody knows that, you have to have photographs. And one of the guys dropped the camera. It turns into a whole big thing in the movie because, again, we need proof, right? But I thought it was actually quite fascinating that in 2019 we have this film coming out that is very much repeating, right, some of the history of the 1960s. Anyway, check it out on Amazon. It's really fun. Finally, the last thing I'll talk about is conspiracy theories related to these guys, Andrew, Sandy Irvine, and George Mallory in 1924. This is the British Everest expedition. They are seen very high on the mountain and then they disappear. Again, they're sort of the two most iconic climbers in some respects. Interestingly, Irvine himself he was a gifted athlete, but wasn't really a climber. He was, however, really good with engineering. So they really brought him along so that he could deal with the oxygen apparatus, which you can see on the back. That's Mallory over there on the left. I gotta say, the guys climbing these mountains in the 1920s were pretty hardcore, compared to the nice down suits and stuff that we have today. So Mallory's body was actually discovered in 1999. Irvine's body has never been discovered, or hadn't been discovered until they found part of him, and I'll talk about that in actually quite recently, just last year, about this time last year, as it happens. Why is this important? Well, because there's all these questions about, well, did Mallory and Irvine actually make it to the top? I happen to fall into the camp that say, it doesn't matter if they made it to the top because they didn't get back down. There's an old chestnut in mountaineering that getting to the top is optional, getting down is not. And in this case, even if they had been the first up there, they were not successful in getting down. But there's all these conspiracy theories related to the Mallory and Irvine thing. Irvine in particular because he apparently had the camera. So people want to develop film. So people have all sorts of crazy ideas, including, well, the Chinese came and got Mallory's body, or the Chinese came and they found Sandy Irvine and now he is in Lhasa on ice, waiting for who knows what. And it's a bit, when you're talking about being above 8,000 meters, it can be hard to get yourself off a mountain, never mind a corpse that can't help you, right? Or walk. Nevertheless, this is actually all going to be a bit reignited because in October of last year, part of Irvine was found, and we know that because early mountaineers were nice enough to get custom clothing with name tags, which is very nice. So when you find stuff, you can be like, oh, this is who it is. This is actually pretty typical for glaciers. Parts of people and parts of expeditions get spat out on a regular basis. That's actually exactly what happened here. This set off a furor because the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association took possession of the remains, didn't send them back to the family. But this has gotten people interested again in the issue of what happened to Mallory and Irvine and what have the Chinese done with the bodies. Because a lot of people are quite convinced that the Chinese have done something with the bodies. And again, it has a variety of ways of explaining itself, but I really look forward to digging into it more. The one that really blew my mind, I was actually on my way to Switzerland to present at a conference on Asia and the Alps, and this came across my screen. So it doesn't, it doesn't make any sense. New twist and mystery of Mount Everest and the British explorers' missing bodies. So now they really are convinced that some people are convinced that, the Chinese government ordered Mallory to be taken off of the mountain. At sometime during 2008, there's a guy that's written extensively on this. Most of the quotes he has are third and fourth hand, or like, I talked to an official in the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association who told me that Irvine's body was thrown off a long time ago. And my sort of general feeling is you generally don't become a pretty big head honcho bureaucrat in the PRC or anywhere really, if you're flapping your mouth to foreigners about things of a sensitive nature. But it's fascinating to me that we're still talking about this, that China is still actually at the center of some of these conspiracy theories. And we're still talking about what happened to Mallory and Irvine 100 years later. Are we ever going to let it go? No, I don't actually think we are. But it's something that I look forward to exploring. There's a lot of other conspiracy theories besides, but these are some of the big ones related to Mount Everest. So that is my stuff on mountaineering. Thank you guys. I realize that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I will pause there and
we'll do Q&A.
Yeah.